Imagine creating some of the most beautiful works in history, while a mental storm slowly consumes you. Robert Schumann not only composed music, he also fought against his own demons. And sometimes those demons won. Today, I will tell you the story of one of the most intense, tragic, and brilliant composers of the Romantic era, Robert Schumann. A man whose life was a constant battle between genius and madness, and whose music, even today, still touches the deepest fibers of the human soul. Get ready for an emotional journey through the life of a tormented artist, a tireless romantic, and a pioneer who changed music forever. Robert Schumann was born on June 8, 1810, in Zwickau, a small town in Saxony, Germany. He was the fifth child of August Schumann and Johanna Christian Schnabel. His father was a man of letters, owner of a bookstore and book publisher. He had a brilliant mind, a love for German and foreign literature, and a great interest in promoting culture in his city. From a very young age, Robert was surrounded by novels, poems, leather-bound volumes, and music. It was a childhood marked by sensitivity. At 4 years old, Robert could already recite entire passages of poetry. At 6, he improvised melodies on the family piano. At 8, he began composing small pieces. But not only that, he also displayed an intense emotional life. He was introspective, dreamy, and had such a vivid imagination that he sometimes struggled to distinguish fantasy from reality. This trait, so common among artists, would later become a source of suffering. His first great hero was Jean-Paul Richter, a writer who combined the philosophical with the emotional and the fantastic. Jean-Paul spoke of the human soul as an unexplored universe. That vision sank deeply into young Schumann, who would later try to do with music what Richter did with words: explore the inner abyss. By the age of 14, Robert had already written a philosophical essay on musical aesthetics and composed several youthful works. However, that same year, tragedy struck for the first time: the death of his father. This loss marked a turning point. His mother, now a widow, became even more protective and fearful of the uncertain future that the art world offered. She decided that her son should study a serious career: law. Thus, reluctantly, Robert was sent to Leipzig in 1828 to begin his legal studies. But inside, music kept calling like an underground river. He couldn't ignore it. In Leipzig, he began attending concerts, mingling with musicians, and dreaming, more and more seriously, of a destiny different from the one his mother had planned. It was in Leipzig that Robert met the man who would shape his career: Friedrich Wieck, a renowned piano teacher. Wieck had his own method, rigorous, almost scientific, for training concert pianists. His greatest experiment so far was his own daughter Clara, whom he had trained with iron discipline from a very young age to turn her into a prodigy. Robert, seeing the quality of his teaching, convinced Wieck to accept him as a student. Thus began a period of intense, almost monastic study. For hours and hours a day, Schumann practiced scales, technical passages, virtuoso studies. He wanted to become the next great pianist of Europe, to rival figures like Franz Liszt or Sigismund Thalberg. But the body has its limits. In his desperation to improve, Schumann used a mechanical device that he himself had invented to strengthen his fingers, a kind of traction harness that put pressure on the tendons while he played. The result was devastating. He ended up permanently damaging the fourth finger of his right hand. He could never play with precision again. To fuel your passion for music, at the end of this video I am going to reveal you the best books for musicians, such as practical guides for learning to play the piano, inspiring biographies of great composers, and books on success secrets that reveal the discipline and creativity needed to thrive in music. Find them in the description. The news was like a sentence. The young man who dreamed of ovations in Europe's great theaters now saw that door close forever. He fell into a deep depression. He shut himself in. He wrote dark phrases in his diary. He spoke of death, of failure, of the pain of having lost his path. But in the midst of the pain, something was reborn. If he couldn't perform, he would compose. If he couldn't express his soul through the keyboard, he would do it with the pen. And not only by composing music, also by writing music criticism. Because Robert Schumann had a sharp pen and an analytical mind. In 1834, he founded the journal Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, a publication that became the most influential platform for romantic music in Germany. From its pages, Schumann not only evaluated works, he also promoted an idea, that of the artist as a visionary, as a tortured being, as a tragic hero. He elevated the figure of the young and daring composer, and from there launched the careers of several emerging geniuses. One of them would be Johannes Brahms. Schumann's music was never simple, neither technically nor emotionally. From his early works, such as Papillons, Abegg Variations, Carnival, or Kreisleriana, it was clear that he was not writing for easy applause. His pieces were fragmented, poetic, unpredictable. They were, in a sense, reflections of a fractured mind. And Schumann began very young to speak in his diaries of an internal duality. Two voices, two identities that inhabited his soul, Florestan and Eusebius. Florestan was unbridled passion, impulsive energy, the storm. Eusebius was calm, tenderness, contemplation. Both alternated in his work, sometimes even within the same piece. In Carnival, for example, Schumann creates a parade of musical characters, some real and others fictional. Florestan and Eusebius have their own movements within the work. This technique was not only innovative, it was revolutionary. It turned the piano into a psychological stage. Each note, each silence, was an unspoken emotion, a repressed thought, a piece of the soul made sound. But this expressive richness also concealed a profound suffering. Schumann was not acting. He truly lived divided. He was tormented by extreme mood swings, periods of creative euphoria followed by phases of paralyzing depression. Although there was no clear diagnosis at the time, many now believe he suffered from severe bipolar disorder. And yet, that same internal fracture was his creative source. What for others would have been an obstacle, for Schumann was artistic material. He turned his pain into art. His emotional instability became an aesthetic, a way of telling the world, this is what it feels like to be alive. This is how madness, beauty, love, and fear sound. And the public, though bewildered at first, began to understand him, to respect him, to admire him. Schumann was becoming more than a composer. He was the inner voice of an entire generation of romantic artists. Amid this emotional and intellectual whirlwind, she appeared, Clara Wieck. She wasn't just the teacher's daughter. She was an imposing figure in her own right. Since the age of 9, she had been performing in public. At 12, she was already recognized as one of the most prodigious pianists in Europe. Clara was brilliant, determined, and possessed a maturity that exceeded her years. And Robert, of course, fell at her feet, both for her talent and her heart. What they had was not an impulsive crush. It was a deep connection forged over the years through music. They played together, wrote letters, shared dreams. But when their affection turned into romantic love, the world around them became hostile. Especially one person, Friedrich Wieck. Clara's father reacted with fury. He didn't just oppose the relationship. He launched an active campaign to separate them. He believed Schumann was a weak man, emotionally unstable, with no financial future. He thought his daughter, a rising star, deserved better. He began to monitor her, intercept her letters, and even forbade her to mention Robert's name. But true love is stubborn. Clara and Robert kept writing to each other in secret, making plans, dreaming of a future together. For 5 years they lived a clandestine love story, full of obstacles and risks. Each letter was a hope. Each fleeting encounter, a spark that fueled their resistance. Finally, in 1839, they made a radical decision to sue Friedrich Wieck in court so they could marry without his consent. It was a scandal. The trial dragged on for more than a year. But in the end, love won. The court ruled in their favor. And on September 12, 1840, Clara and Robert married in secret in a small church near Leipzig, one day before Clara's 21st birthday, when she no longer needed her father's permission. The union was not only emotional, it was artistic. Together they created a home full of music, sensitivity, and creative complicity. Clara continued touring Europe, while Robert composed and wrote. They admired each other, influenced each other, inspired each other. But the emotional intensity that united them would also bring deep challenges. Because you cannot live on passion alone, especially when mental health begins to crumble. The year of his wedding was also one of the most extraordinary of his career as a composer. 1840 is known as the Liederjahr, or the Year of Songs. In just 12 months, Schumann composed more than 140 Lieder, songs for voice and piano based on German poetry. It is an astonishing creative feat, comparable to the great cycles of Bach or the quartets of Beethoven. But these songs were not simple musical pieces. They were confessions, sonic diaries. Each line encapsulated deep, often contradictory emotions. Longing, the euphoria of requited love, the anguish of time, the fear of loss. Works like Dieterlieb, the poet's love, and Frauenlieb Jugendleben, a woman's love and life, are still performed worldwide for their emotional intensity and refined musical language. In Dieterlieb, for example, each song is like a torn page from a broken heart. Based on poems by Heinrich Heine, the cycle traces an emotional arc that moves from romantic hope to the bitterest disillusionment. Schumann achieved something unique. The piano not only accompanied the voice, it completed it. Sometimes it even contradicted it. What is not said in words, the piano says, and sometimes what it says is heartbreaking. This creative explosion had a clear source: Clara. She was his muse, his ideal interpreter, his life and art companion. Every song was a tribute, but also a plea, because deep down, Schumann knew his balance was fragile. And although he was at the peak of his productivity, something dark was beginning to grow beneath the surface. Starting in 1841, the signs of mental instability began to intensify. Although he continued composing, including symphonies, chamber music, and his famous piano concerto in a minor, Robert was beginning to show worrying symptoms: insomnia, anxiety, auditory hypersensitivity, depression. He had episodes of delirium. He said he heard voices, bells that no one else heard, chords that sounded in his head at all hours, as if a ghostly orchestra pursued him day and night. Sometimes they were sublime harmonies, other times horrible dissonances that drove him to despair. He began to obsess over the idea that spirits were dictating music to him from beyond. This belief affected not only his work but also his domestic life. Clara, in addition to continuing to perform, compose, and give concerts, had to care for a husband who was sometimes a genius and at other times a man on the verge of collapse. Between 1844 and 1846, he suffered a nervous breakdown so severe that he was forced to leave his position as music director in Dresden. They moved to Dusseldorf hoping for a fresh start, but his problems persisted. Even so, he continued composing works of unusual beauty, such as the Rhenish Symphony and his most mature chamber music. In 1853, fate brought to his door a 20-year-old young man with a portfolio full of manuscripts, Johannes Brahms. Schumann was dazzled. He immediately recognized the overwhelming talent of this introverted young man and wrote an article in his magazine titled New Paths, in which he proclaimed Brahms as the future of German music. The relationship between the Schumanns and Brahms became deep. Brahms became a close friend, a disciple, and a sort of adopted son, but also an emotional support for Clara, who was beginning to bear on her shoulders the weight of a household where Robert's deterioration was becoming increasingly evident. The shadow of madness was no longer a distant threat. It was a constant presence, drawing ever closer. And the worst was yet to come. The year 1854 marked the final breaking point. Robert's mental health had deteriorated to the limit. His delusions were constant. He said he received messages from angels. Other times, he heard demonic voices whispering incomprehensible words. The torment was unbearable. He began having suicidal thoughts. On February 27th of that year, Schumann left his home in Dusseldorf without telling anyone. He walked to the Rhine River, a wandering, desolate figure. When he reached the bridge, he threw himself into the water. His suicide attempt was dramatic but unsuccessful. Some boatmen rescued him just in time. The news shocked the musical world and left Clara plunged into despair. After the incident, Robert was admitted by medical decision to a psychiatric asylum in Endenich, near Bonn. There he would spend the last 2.5 years of his life. The place was silent, orderly, almost monastic, but it offered no cure. The psychiatric techniques of the time were rudimentary, if not brutal. Confinement was more a form of oblivion than treatment. During the first months, Clara was not allowed to visit him. The doctors believed her presence would upset him. She, anguished and pregnant with her 8th child, continued giving concerts to support the family and the children. Meanwhile, Brahms became her main emotional support, writing letters and helping her endure the weight of a life that was falling apart. In the asylum, Robert went through phases of lucidity and deterioration. Sometimes he wrote musical fragments which no one could later decipher. Other times he sat in front of a blank sheet for hours, motionless. His body was beginning to shut down, but his mind continued spinning in unfathomable spirals. Music, that force that had sustained him all his life, now became a distant, almost cruel echo. In July 1856, exhausted and gravely weakened, Robert finally received Clara's visit. It was a brief but deeply emotional encounter. He could barely speak. She held his hand, sang him some of his songs, and promised him that his music would not die with him. A few days later, on July 29th, Robert Schumann died. He was only 46 years old. After Schumann's death, life went on, but the mark he left was indelible. His complete works, composed in just a couple of decades, encompass all genres: piano pieces, symphonies, songs, chamber music, concertos, even operas. And in each of them, one can feel his soul. Torn, passionate, dreamlike, human. For a long time, his figure was overshadowed by tragedy. People spoke more about his madness than his music. But over the years, his genius was reevaluated. Musicians, performers, and critics began to understand the depth of his artistic vision. Schumann did not seek to entertain. He sought to reveal, to open a door to the inner world, to make music that thought, that felt, that hurt. His influence extends to this day. Johannes Brahms, who loved and admired him so much, said that every note he wrote was a conversation with Robert. Gustav Mahler, Claude Debussy, even modern composers, have recognized in him an inexhaustible source of inspiration. But perhaps his greatest legacy lies not only in his music but in his story. The story of a man who, despite adversity, turned his fragility into art, who, in the midst of darkness, continued creating beauty, who, even when his mind failed, his heart kept speaking through the notes. Clara Schumann, for her part, became the guardian of his legacy. She performed his music for decades, edited his works, wrote about him, and kept his memory alive. She was more than a faithful widow. She was a brilliant artist who managed to maintain her own voice while caring for the echo of Robert's. And so, between shadows and lights, between music and silence, Robert Schumann became more than a composer. He became a symbol, proof that art often springs from the deepest pain, that madness and genius, far from excluding each other, sometimes walk hand in hand. And that as long as someone listens to his music, Schumann will keep speaking of love, of struggle, of humanity. If this story moved you, if you felt that music can be a bridge to the deepest parts of the human soul, then subscribe. On this channel, we celebrate the geniuses, the forgotten ones, those who fell and yet left us light. Robert Schumann's life was not perfect, but it was, without a doubt, unforgettable.